The key findings of our study is that at least 314 children, primarily from what's called the Donbass, which is the eastern region of Ukraine, were deported forcibly into a program of coercive fostering and adoption by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. They were moved to over 21 regions inside Russia, and over a period of months, they were nationalized into citizens of Russia, and most notably, the majority of them were adopted by Russian families in contravention of international law and basic decency. Russia took many steps to execute this program. The first is they had to make it comply with Russia's federal law on the adoption of children inside Russia. And what that means is that for these children to be adopted and fostered, they had to make them citizens of Russia to comply with their own domestic code. Additionally, Russia had to make sure that these children could be adopted by families. And what that meant is placing them in 3 different adoption databases. And that's how Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab identified them, by being able to corroborate listings in these databases with open source information to identify that these children were not from Russia, they were from Ukraine. The role of the databases in this investigation was key. There are 3 databases. One is operated by the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation. The second is run by a non-governmental organization that contracts with the Ministry of Education. And the third is run by an organization called Change One Life. They share information and they share listings and provide videos about the kids. It was those videos and photographs that, when combined with other information we had gleaned from the internet over almost 20 months of investigation, we were able to combine that information together to come to a high confidence finding that at least 314 of these children, who were presented as being the same as Russian children up for adoption, were in fact from Ukraine. Russia's placement of the children has changed in 2 major ways since 2022. In the first 6 months after the invasion, these children were taken to basically halfway houses, midpoints, and they were held there until September 2022. At that point, they began to be placed for adoption through the databases and were subsequently nationalized, the majority of them, as citizens of Russia. The reason we believe that they held them at those midpoint locations until September was to wait for the annexation of the territories that they came from in an illegal annexation process by Russia that claimed those territories as part of the Russian Federation. The Humanitarian Research Lab, using a combination of very high-resolution satellite imagery and open source information, was able to actually watch the planes that moved these children, both from Ukraine and within Russia. And we learned a lot about the specific planes that were involved. There were 2 groups of planes. One was run by Russia's Aerospace Defense Force, aka its Air Force, and the other group of planes actually reported to President Putin's office at the Kremlin, such as the air wing that controls Air Force One for the Americans. These were the planes that reported directly to the president of Russia. In other words, President Putin's own military and own transportation wing was responsible for moving these children inside Russia and to Russia from Ukraine, and we can see them in satellite imagery. There were 2 reasons that Russia nationalized the children from Ukraine as citizens of Russia. Reason 1 is that Russia's law required, in order to adopt and foster a child, they had to be citizens of Russia. The second reason is part of a broader campaign of what we call Russification. The goal of this program is to turn children from Ukraine into children from Russia, not only in terms of their passport, but in terms of their language, their culture, and their very identity.
So my team's legal analysis of the facts and the evidence that was documented in this report is that it establishes a basis for potential crimes against humanity, war crimes, and perhaps even part of a broader case of genocide. And in addition, it establishes a basis for believing that Russia, which is a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, may be also in violation, almost certainly is in violation of its obligations under that convention. So there's an extensive set of clear violations of international criminal law that are documented here. So one question that's natural to ask is there going to be any accountability? So we have all this evidence, we have all this information, there's all this detailed reports about particular children who've been taken out of Ukraine to Russia and the various abuses that have been taking place as part of the evidence that's being documented in this report. And the natural question is there going to be any accountability? So we have all this evidence, we have all this information, but what happens next? And there's a lot of different answers to that. So one answer is that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed in Ukraine since 2014. And the International Criminal Court is currently investigating various crimes that are being committed, including the forced deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia. And so this report provides detailed information and evidence that can be used to support cases in the International Criminal Court. And so that's one way in which there will be accountability, and that's accountability for Putin, for Maria Lvova-Belova, and for all of the other officials that have been involved in this process, in this program of forced deportation. But that's not all. So that's one way in which there will be accountability. In addition, the Ukrainian courts can prosecute these crimes as well. So Ukrainian courts can prosecute the forced deportation that's taking place. They can prosecute war crimes. They can prosecute crimes against humanity. The change in Ukraine's law that was just made in the last year allows for prosecution of crimes against humanity. And so there's a possibility of prosecution within Ukraine's courts for these various violations. And then last, there's also the prospect of accountability in other states' courts. So if any of those who are responsible for committing these crimes within Ukraine and in Russia travel, say, to one of these surrounding countries that has universal jurisdiction over these crimes, then they potentially could be brought to justice in the foreign domestic courts of these other states. So there are a lot of possibilities for accountability, and the first step is what this report does, which is provide the facts, provide the evidence, provide the information, and then there's a number of different accountability mechanisms out there for actually bringing those who are responsible to justice. Yeah, so there are already arrest warrants that have been issued against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for their role in the forced deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia. And so one might wonder, what's the point of this? Why is this additional information going to make any difference? And the answer is manyfold. First of all, this provides a lot more information, a lot more detailed information about particular children who have been deported, the particular reasons, how they were deported. There's documentation of lots of the details and all the various systemic moves that were made to make this possible and all the different people who were involved in it. So there's a mountain of evidence that is compiled as part of this report. And it also provides a basis for accountability, not just for Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, but for all the other officials who've been involved in this process. Because what this does is that by documenting particular children and the role that the state has played and various officials have played in deportation of particular children, there provides a possibility of actually accountability not just for the two figures who've already been had arrest warrants issued against them by the International Criminal Court, but for all the others who've been involved. And what I will add is that some ask, what's the point of this? What's the point of these arrest warrants? Putin's never going to leave Russia. He's not likely to be thrown in the dock anytime soon. And part of the answer to that is it constricts his world. It constricts the world of everyone who is potentially subject to criminal prosecution as a result of these crimes, because they now cannot travel to any of the 125 states that are party to the Rome Statute, because if they do, those states are obligated to arrest them. And so it shrinks their world. It makes it much harder for them to travel. It makes it much harder for them to live their lives. And it also sends a message to all these mid-level, low-level bureaucrats within the Russian army and perhaps those who are working with them, that there is eventually going to be accountability for these crimes, and to cause them to think twice before they participate in these kinds of crimes and future forced deportations of children from occupied parts of Ukraine.
Russia has taken several steps to hide this program. The most obvious and most important one is that the way the children were placed in the database made no distinction that they were in fact from Ukraine. It presented these children in their origin points as being from locations in Russia. The second thing that they did to hide these children is they changed PII, and that stands for personally identifiable information in some cases. Additionally, as we investigated over months, we saw that records in the database disappeared and they changed at critical junctures where outside events would make it politically make sense for Russia to hide this information, such as indictments against Vladimir Putin and the head of the program, a woman named Maria Lvova-Belova, by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Right now, we know generally where some of the children in our study, the 314 we identified, where they were last located, but we don't know their precise locations. Additionally, and this is the big issue, we only have a snippet, a small group of children, and we believe that the number who have moved into this program of coercive adoption and fostering by the Russian Federation is in fact much larger and contains kids from areas that we don't document in our report, other occupied areas. It is now incumbent upon Russia's government to tell the truth. How many kids do you have, President Putin? Where are they? And when can they come home? I think the question everyone who is learning about this report is asking is, how do the children come home? And I wish I had a simple answer, and I wish I had a good answer. But the fact of the matter is that Russia at every stage has violated the basic requirements under the Geneva Conventions that it, as a member, as a party to the Geneva Conventions, has to comply with. It needs to register the children with the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations. It needs to enable them to call their government, to call their families. It needs to allow the Red Cross and the UN to access these children. And it needs to move them to a third-party neutral country as soon as possible. That's how they come home. But right now, what we've documented in this program is that Russia not only has failed, but has actively tried to prevent these children from being found.